Today we are in Parashat Mishpatim. Parashat Mishpatim. We've talked about the Chukim, the Mishpatim, and the Torot. Right? The Torot is the plural of Torah. The Mishpatim is what we have translated here as the ordinances in the New American Standard. They're not all so bad. I don't know what the NIV says.
Who cares?
Who cares?
Not inspired.
So the Torot is the plural of Torah, the Mishpatim is the ordinances, and then the Chukim is the worship commandments. It's kind of hard. I think they usually translate it as the. I'm drawing a blank. I'm drawing a blank on the English. No, the Adut is actually that's the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
Yeah, I never taught that here, but that's
just the thing.
that's the Ten Commandments, which in English is the testimonies.
Right.
The testimonies. Psalm 119 talks a lot about the testimonies,
Right.
and that is a strict. It is limited strictly to the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
Yeah, it's beautiful when you see it in context and you realize, yeah, that's what that is. So. It always is, right?
Text out of context to preach.
Yeah. I think its context is like what they say in real estate, right? Location, location, location. Well, where is your text located?
Right.
You know, that's context.
What was it intended for first?
Right. So Parashat Mishpatim, Exodus 21 through 24. And this is extremely important passage and section of Scripture because it follows up the Ten Commandments and it's going to go and explain the Ten Commandments. Obviously, there's so much that we could do here with this passage. We could go and show how the Ten Commandments really are a summary of the Chukim and the Mishpatim. Some of the commandments have to do with worship, Shabbat, the Lord's name, worship, the Lord alone. So, and then the other ones have to do with man to man, which is the Mishpatim. If you take a forest view instead of the trees, which you take a forest view of the Mishpatim, of these commandments in 21 through 23, and you're able to classify them under the commandments, then you will see they're actually kind of limited in terms of a bunch of commandments speak of you shall not steal, and a bunch of commandments fall under you shall not murder. Because murdering is going to include, as Yeshua taught, right? If you're just mean to somebody, you can kill with your words, and so a lot of it is it has to do with that. And so what we're going to do is we're only going to the Mishpatim actually have 42 cases. When you put it all together, it has 42 cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to take just the first two. Maybe if we have a little time, we'll go into 2 or 3 more after those, but we're going to stay in chapter 21. And what I want to do is, towards the end, I want us to have a very specific and important application with the rest of our time that we actually did last year. If you were last year with us when we did Mishpatim, then you will remember this, and we're going to do it again because over half of you were not here. So, Exodus 21, the book of Shemot 21. We're going to begin right at verse 1. So it says, now these are the ordinances, the Mishpatim, which you are to set before them. So this is the Lord speaking to Moses. to give to Israel. Verse 2. Some of you are going to remember this. Look at what I have highlighted in blue, and look below here. I have it highlighted in, what would you call this? Beige? Pink? You know, we guys are very, very limited in the colors we see. Right? Very basic. Okay. But in the English, you see it's the word if, right? We saw this. We saw this a while back. I believe in the book of Deuteronomy, when it sets a lot of cases. This has to do with case law. And so in the blue, if you could read the Hebrew at the bottom, which I still don't have a way to figure out how to make it big, but if you could, you would read that it is the Hebrew word ki. And then with I'm going to go with orange at the bottom. With the orange, then the Hebrew is im. Im. Im can mean with, right? But it can also be translated as if. Now, what's important here is that ki in the blue, almost 100% of the time, not 100, but almost 100% of the times, sets up a major case. Like if you're going to speak about the commandments, then this is the primary case. And then the word im in the orange at the bottom here, that's the one that sets up the sub-cases. So you have the bigger case, and then what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? Okay? And we see it here in a very clear way. So the first case, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. Notice the word slave is eved, which is the same word for servant. The word serve is avad, same Hebrew root. So I chuckle sometimes when we read in our English translations that Paul writing and he says the bondservant. That has no meaning in English. Bondservant, we don't know what that is. Really, if we're honest with each other, we don't know what that is. Bondservant. I don't know. But the Greek word that he uses is actually slave. So it is a play on the Hebrew, right? So he's not so much a servant in the sense that, a servant gets to go home at night and have his own life, but a slave does not. So he's saying, I am a slave, right? I am free to be a slave. I'm free from sin, not from the law. I'm free from the bondage of rabbinic tradition, right? To be a servant of righteousness. He says that in Romans 6. I'm a slave to righteousness. And we want to be slaves to righteousness. Because you can only be a servant of sin if you're not a slave to righteousness. But in any case, so if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. But on the 7th, he shall go out as a free man. You want to take a guess as to the Hebrew is for go out? Yatzah. Yatzah. Right? That's the regular word for the Exodus. It's not hard to see if you are a slave and you get to go free, that is like an Exodus to you. Right? There was a struggle, there was a Pharaoh figure, and now the Lord has delivered you from that.
So why then, if they are fresh out of Egypt, where they are slaves, so I don't understand the willingness to make someone else a slave if they already know what it's like to be one. Yeah,
great question. And number one, it has to do with the culture of the time. We are blinded to our own culture. That's usually the way it happens. Because we're ethnocentric. Everyone is. Italians are. No, they're not, right? No, they're not. and Americans are. We all are. And so we're blinded to our culture. And God works through our culture. And He's very patient. And He did so at that time. He worked through slavery. He worked through having multiple wives, and even with people like Abraham and David, and so what He then is trying to do is trying to work from within the system to make it a system that is based on righteousness and justice. That's what we see here with the Mishpatim. So the goal is to have society. This is also a protective measure. So God is redeeming this institution. We have to understand that to think of slavery in the Bible is absolutely not even close to what American slavery was. Not even close. We read about Abraham's servant, what was his name? Eliezer. That guy had it made. I mean, that guy had everything he wanted, had an awesome boss, and he didn't want to. He had no reason to leave. And so, slavery in that, although the word is used slave, it was completely different than what we experience in the Western sense of the word. And so what then God is trying to work through inside the institution is to make it one that is working towards seeing freedom applied in every case, in every individual case, without oppression. That's the goal. Because if you can have the relationship in itself, it's actually protective. Because why would a person give themselves in slavery? Because they actually had a huge debt. That was the primary reason. Because there was a huge debt that he couldn't pay. So you give yourself in slavery knowing you're not going to, or trusting that according to the Torah, you're not going to be oppressed and abused. And that there will be the time when you will not only recover your freedom, personal freedom, but if you lost your land, you will eventually, or at least your family eventually will recover that piece of land, therefore being restored to financial stability. The biblical economic system is absolutely the best because it already provides you from the get-go with ownership of land, which is real, well, pun intended, real property. That will set your family up for good. But the system that you actually get to recover it is pretty incredible in itself.
The American cultural equivalent to bondservant is indentured servant.
It's what?
Indentured servant.
Yeah, but still.
Citizens would get a huge amount of money paid for them to travel from England to the New World, and then work for several years to pay back what would be the equivalent of like a house.
Yeah, that's great, but it doesn't, you don't get that with the first reading. You'll have to study that. That's my point, that, I would vote for translating it as slave, Paul, a slave of Yeshua, rather than saying words that, okay, we don't know what that really means.
Oh, yeah, I'm saying the American cultural equivalent, you were talking about the cultural is indentured servant. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was what was in America.
Thanks. And so then the goal is to make the institution one that is not oppressive and that is working towards freedom and land ownership so that the person can be financially stable at the same level as anybody else in society. And so so because of that, then you're really walking towards an exodus, a being free from oppression. We're all on an exodus. We are all in one way or another, in one aspect or another in our lives, walking towards praying for and hoping and crying out for an exodus of some sort or another. Even if it's just to make it into our promised land, you are in an exodus. You are in a process of being taken from one place to the next, where it will be your promised land of sorts. And we have many processes. Individually, we have many processes that are going that way. That's so much the nature of our human experience that I would venture out to say that this is actually a philosophical setup from the Torah as a view of life, to see life as an exodus, as a constant exodus in so many aspects of our lives. Being set free and brought into the promised land, and so many of the details that includes. So Hebrew slaves supposed to go out as a free man without payment. Without payment. This is huge in terms of the exodus from Egypt, as well as the Babylonian captivity. Because in the prophets, the Lord says several times that you were taken into slavery for nothing, for no reason. Even Israel taken into Babylon, you can say, well, they sinned and they did this and they did that. Yes, but they didn't do that to Babylon. And so for Babylon to have ownership and to take Israel captive and to come in and destroy and take and plunder was absolutely without basis and without reason. Because of that, then God delivers Israel from Egypt and from Babylon without having to pay anything, because they didn't pay anything originally.
Good word.
And so the payment, if there's any payment, the payment is actually judgment. That's what God paid Egypt. And that's what God paid Babylon. It was judgment because of their oppression, because of taking Israel captive and forcing them into slavery on both cases. That is a setup also for the end times. Right? It's the end times. It's all about a big Pharaoh and Israel being set free to possess the land. That's basically the book of Revelation right there, in a nutshell. Right? It's funny. I can teach Revelation in 10 seconds, but I can't get through the portion. I once taught Ruth 1:1 an hour and a half, and I didn't finish. I didn't finish Ruth 1:1. I didn't finish verse 1. And a friend of mine, he was taking notes on his Bible. You know, he started taking notes, and by the end, the whole page was full, and he was like, "What are you doing to me?" Good old times. So verse 3 then. Now we have the im. So the blue is key, the main case. Now we're going to see the subcases. So in verse 3 says, if he comes alone, then he shall go out alone. That's the case. Look in verse 4. There's a different case. If his master gives him a wife, then he is... Why this? Well, remember, these are things that are going to get modeled and are going to have to be brought to judges. So the judge has the Torah as his guide, as his book of precedents. So he's going to read and say, well, did you have a wife when you went in? Well, no, I didn't. But I was engaged to this girl who actually was owned by the same guy. Oh, okay, so what do we do in that case? So it gets a little complicated, but you have the basic cases from which then you make decisions. And that's what the Torah is about. It's about establishing the primary cases, and then from there having to judge. I was talking to Mark the other day, and he was asking me, aren't we supposed to judge? The book of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians says that we will judge. And so yeah, it means we will be the ones who administer compassionate decisions on behalf of people, even in the millennium, because not everyone is going to be saved in the millennium. So you will have a bunch of people who are believers. Did I say saved? No, I meant transformed. Not everyone is going to be transformed. Not everyone in the millennium is going to have a glorified body. But we will, just by reason of being believers before the millennium happens. So you will judge people here on earth. Wherever you end up living, probably where you are from. So I guess we'll still be here, and be judges. So we will judge people according to the Torah. But I'm getting way out of of what I have prepared. So verse 3: if he comes alone, he shall go alone. Right? If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. 4, if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and the children shall belong to the master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man. You realize that go out here always is the word for Exodus, right? Yatzah. So it's all over the place. It's the atmosphere, really, that the whole passage lives in. So verse 6, then his master shall bring him to God, then he shall bring, and when it says to God, how do you bring them to God? Well, you bring him to the judges. So you need to make this what's the word? You needed to make it a legal decision so that it holds, kind of like a contractual decision. So you need to have paper trail, so to speak, right? Except that in the time it was you go to the judges and then it's established that you did this just in case in the future, right? So bring him to God, to the judges. Then he shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. All right, we could get into all sorts of details there, but we're not going to, right? So we're going to jump into the next case. And in a few minutes, I want us to go back I want to use these two cases to have a little bit of a ministry time and allow us to hear the Holy Spirit directly. All right, so the second case here in verse 7 is so here we have the big case, right? And we're going to have in verse 8, you can see a subcase. So the big case is, if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free. Look at the word Exodus. She is not to go, yatzah, free, as the male slaves do. And the word do is also yatzah. So it should have been better translated as the male slaves go. So she won't go out as the male slaves go out. Now, wait a minute. You're a woman and you say, what? What are you talking about? Easy for you to say, buddy, you're a man. What is this Moses dude saying here? Actually, this is God speaking. So, this is the old times. God is kind of chauvinistic. It's the Old Testament anyway, so... Is that how we solve that?
No, that's how they solve.
That's how some people solve that, right? All right, so what can we do then? Because we know this has to be saying something different. All right. So let's see if we can untangle this, if I can get myself out of this mess. So, if a man sells his daughter, why would a man sell his daughter, and why would God not allow her to go free? Well, believe it or not, this is protective. This is protective. A man will sell his daughter because he's absolutely poor. He's probably in debt. He's probably having to sell himself in slavery. And so he's saying, listen, honey, I have no way of getting you married, of finding a husband for you, and I think the best thing, think of it as adopting her out. I love you, but you will have a better life in a different setting, in a different family. So they all have hard times. So this is a way that a father will say, I want to ensure that you go into a better situation. Now look what happens. That in verse 8, if she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, we're going to go back to verse 7 because we haven't solved it yet. But we're in the process of doing that. So verse 8, if, this is a subcase, right? If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. What do we have here? Well, notice that in the Torah, the stories, we have a whole book of stories, a book and a half actually, Genesis and the half of Exodus, of stories, of narrative, before we get into commandments. So the Torah isn't just commandments. Why is that? Well, in the stories, you have illustrated the commandments. You have the commandments illustrated. This is how you love the Lord your God. So you look at the life of Abraham, right? This is not how you love your neighbor, and you look at the life of Jacob. But then the commandments actually have narratives. When you get into the world of this little passage here, and you see this family struggling, this is a story. You can make a movie out of this little story here. And it's supposed to be a commandment, right? This is a family struggling, and what is the father going to do to ensure his daughter's well-being in the future? And then the guy takes her and he designates her for her. He's going to marry her. So the dad is happy. It's the best scenario. And let's say that the girl is actually either too young and he's going to wait, or there are maybe a few months, maybe a year for him to marry her, and then all of a sudden he changes his mind. Well, that's not cool. And God doesn't think it's cool. So it says, he shall then go out, she shall then he shall let her be redeemed. What does that mean then? Well, I think it means that somebody else can come and pay for her. Who would that be? The dad is broke. Who would that be? Somebody else that wants to marry her. So the guy cannot hold her forever without marrying her. That will be unfair. And so the Torah says, then you have to let her go. You have to let her go so she can go and be married. So these are protective measures because, again, the way that it worked was the property was owned by men, but on behalf of the family. So it wasn't his to exclude his wife or daughters. It was his to work it so that he can provide for wife and daughters. And so the Torah makes provisions so that a woman is not out in society alone without protection. She can't be protected by the father, and so the Torah makes provisions so that she is married properly and be under covering and provision. And it further says, he does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. This word unfair is actually because of dealing treacherously, because of betraying her. Really. This looks a little bit like, remember, Ruth was supposed to marry the guy who was actually the closest relative, and the guy said no. And it brought shame on him. This is a little bit like this. You know, see, this guy is betraying this girl, and so there's shame on him. He has to let her go. So, verse 9, we're going to go back to 7. Don't think I forgot about 7, but we're in the process of solving that. Verse 9, here's another subcase, if he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If she takes to himself another woman after her, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. This is a covert way of saying sexual relations. If he will not do these 3 things for her, then she shall go out, and now is the word Exodus, right? Yatzah. She shall go out for nothing without payment. What you have here is divorce. That's what you have here. She's married to him, and he fails to provide these 3 things. And here you thought that the Bible was absolutely 100% against divorce. That's a Christian teaching. Judaism is not bound by that. Because Judaism finds in this text a protection for a woman that is neglected or abused. And a man, by the way, too. And so, we don't have the time to get into more details of the questions that were asked of Yeshua and the answers that he gave about divorce. We're just looking at one aspect here. Every time I counsel, every time I do premarital counseling, I begin with this statement, with this verse, with this passage. And I tell both of them, but I emphasize on the guy. You know, today you're in love and you want to get married and everything is great. But please understand, you can lose all of that. If you don't do this, if you neglect this, if you abuse these things, and please understand that in the greater context here, it really speaks of emotional and spiritual covering for the wife. Those are grounds, biblical grounds, for a woman to say, I am not safe here. I am not provided, I'm not protected here. And frankly, a guy can say that as well.
But if she's coming out of the poverty, now she's there, now she's out. Does she automatically go back to her former status? In other words, how is she protected after she leaves? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously, she already is not provided for. This guy is abusing her. So she is, the reason why it uses the word go out, Yatzah, Exodus, because she's under oppression. So it really places her in the Jewish world. It places her in a position to be able to remarry. That's where eventually it will end up. And that's the reason, even today in the Jewish world, that's the reason why you have, for a woman, it's extremely important that when she's rejected by a husband, that she gets a get. And now we're getting a little bit into Jewish tradition. But she gets a certificate of divorce so that she will be free to remarry. Because it will be oppressive for the man to withhold that from her. And it happens. It does happen. So again, these are all protective measures for the woman. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question. If you could maybe talk about, relating to the verse, how in a ketubah, in the Jewish wedding contract, usually they'll have these 3 requirements in the marriage contract in a Jewish wedding.
Yeah, I think you just said it. These 3 requirements are part of the Jewish marital contract, which is it's a contract that has validity within the Jewish world. So you can go to a rabbi and say, hey, he ain't doing this. And so
And that's how the woman can get the
she can get a certificate of divorce.
And in the
Yes.
Orthodox community, a woman, if she doesn't have that get, she's essentially shunned
Yeah.
if she's separated from the husband.
She's in limbo. Mm-hmm. She's in limbo.
Married
Yeah.
without being excommunicated from the community.
And what's important then is also that we live in America, so we think, okay, this is the world of the rabbis and all of that. But in Israel, that is the law. So that is,
It's a big deal.
it's a big deal, yes.
So in this case, with this woman, I'm kind of curious about the difference in status. You're saying she is his wife, she's purchased as a slave. So what's the difference between wife and concubine?
Some commentators use the word concubine here because she wasn't free. So it's possible that that we're in the presence of a concubine. It's possible. I would say I will withhold from leaning too strong on one way or another at this point. But that's a possibility. That's what we're seeing there. Mm-hmm.
The 3 provisions
Yeah.
apply, like he says, concubinal or espousal, because it says here, if he espouses her under the sun, so it's like in that, we call it the engagement period
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like in that holding, it
Yeah.
seems to lean more of this way than an actual ketubah, because the provision 1 is a foreign power. So you get engaged for simplicity. They don't like each other. He can't deal with her. He spins her off to another nation or something. It's over. He can't do anything.
Yeah, he can't. No, what he says, you cannot sell her to a foreign people.
Well, he says you have no power. He says if to sell her under a foreign people, he shall have no power. Oh, for selling.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Number 2 is you can give it to your son. You can take the espoused woman and give it to the son. That doesn't.
Okay, yeah, but it's not like, okay, I don't like her for myself, then I'm going to give it to my son. No, that's not what it is. These are completely different cases.
Amen.
If he didn't want to marry her, then she need to allow her to be redeemed.
Right.
If initially he designated her for his son, then he needs to treat her like a daughter, which will make me think we're in the presence of a spouse, not so much of a concubine. So personally, I will have to study more to lean one way or the other, but these are different cases.
Well, the 3rd provision, if he take him another wife, so it supports a little bit of what you're saying. Another wife, meaning she was wife 1.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or she was wife 2, and if he takes wife 3.
yeah, yeah.
Great thought.
But I yawn. It's getting a little uncomfortable.
A thought came to mind when I was reading this portion. I thought of the Apostle Paul's writings in Corinthians,
Yeah.
where he, in Corinthians 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he says, do not deprive each other except for a short time of prayer.
Right.
You can see that teaching in Corinthians is clearly connected.
It's rooted in this. Mhm.
It's the root of it comes from this whole concept in the Torah, that it wasn't a new thing of a Christian
Right, right.
from the Torah. It's
Right.
rooted
It is
in
Torah.
Moses.
Yep, yeah, yeah. All right, so let's go back to verse 7. We're running out of time. I don't think we're going to be able to do what I intended to do, but we're doing what the Lord intended to do, so. Which is okay. Which is okay. So verse 7, we read again verse 7. If a man sells his daughter, right, not because he wants to, because he's a mean dad, but because he's really fallen into really hard times. So he sells his daughter as a female slave. She is not to go free as the men slaves do, because that would place her in a very difficult position as a single young woman in society without a family, without a father. So actually giving her into a family, kind of like adopting her out into a family, is actually protective. So these are actually protective measures from God himself for women who would find themselves in these situations. Does that read a little different to you now? All right. I want to just end with a brief comment about the nature of these two cases, these two commandments that we've seen here, these two stories here, the story of slavery and the story of women's rights. We'll call it that way for now, right? For now, yeah. And you realize that on my mother's side, I got it all inside me, y'all. I really got it all. Because on my mother's side, they came to Venezuela from Curacao, and they were blacks. They were slaves to the Dutch. So this is something that I don't live with every day. I don't think of myself, gee, I'm descendants of slaves. Wow, that's not, I don't think in those terms.
Good.
But I am. Then on the other hand, if you would have met my dad, you would have seen a white guy, blue eyes, straight from Spain. I remember as a 20-something walking alongside my dad, and girls my age would see him and not me. It's like, what's up with that, The guy was handsome, let me just put it that way. And so, but of course, on his mother and his, both actually on both his mother and his father's side, there is the Spanish Jewish ancestry. And so I've got it all, right? I got the Jewish, I got the white, and I got the black. So don't mess with me. And I got the Hispanic, and I have the Hispanic, of course. I've got the Hispanics. Which means I can make myself out to be a victim on any side I choose to. So here's the thing. I want for us, and this is very much our heart here, that it doesn't matter your background here. But that's not enough. We have to go out of our way. We have to go out of our way to be different than we see today in our society. We have to go out of our way to allow the Lord to work in us, whatever our background, to love one another, whatever the other person's background.
Amen.
When I see you, I see a person. I see a man or a woman. Period. Because that's what I am. I don't see myself from this group, from that group, or for this other group. But I see myself as a person. I have a story, you have a story. But I've been redeemed, and so have you. And we relate to each other on those terms. Right? Same with women. For me, I have a powerful woman as a wife. You know her. Not powerful in the sense that she's going to run over you, but powerful in the sense that she knows who she is. She's confident in who she is. I want that. I want to empower. I want to be empowering toward women that way. Because I think that's what we see in the Torah. This, in the end, this is about empowering people who are coming out of oppressive situations. So that the story really is that this girl married, was provided for, kind of like a Ruth situation. That's really what the Torah has in view, right? So with that, then we'll leave it here. But I want you to understand that these dynamics are very destructive in our society, in our world today, in our culture, in our country today. Here we enter into a kingdom atmosphere. And as a family, we have a kingdom atmosphere. And we're here out to transform the world and not to operate the way the world operates. Amen? Amen. All right, let's pray.